Welcome back to This Is a Commander channel, where this is a Commander channel, and today I'm going to talk about Commander, tough rules, and cool interactions, episode 60. Today's episode is going to cover an aspect of Magic that comes up fairly often, and it is only going to grow in occurrences as Wizards of the Coast continues to make new cards that have replacement effects on them. And this is what do you do when two or more replacement effects try to replace the same thing, as well as when we get into prevention effects. I've covered replacement effects in previous episodes, like episode 13 and 44, but this time I'm going to go over some specific damage replacement effects, as they're probably some of the more common ones that you'll encounter that will overlap in your typical average game of Commander. So, on to the first card that we will talk about today, as it is the newest card from the Brothers' War. The card is Mechanized Warfare, and it's a red enchantment for 1 red, and it says, if a red or artifact source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +1 instead. Now, we can tell that this is a replacement effect because it uses the word instead, which is the biggest dead giveaway in Magic that something is a replacement effect. If you'd like to dig into them more, replacement effects are in section 614 of the comprehensive rules, but there are 17 sub-rules to the replacement effects, and many of those sub-rules have further sub-rules. So it's a pretty intense section of the rules. Then there is section 616 that covers specifically how to handle multiple replacement effects. So let's get into some actual cases of this card having some interactions with other replacement effects. I personally have a Torbran Thane of Red Fell deck, and he has a similar ability to Mechanized Warfare, and it says, if a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2 instead. The only two differences between these two things is that Torbran replaces the source to do 2 extra damage, but he only cares about red sources of damage, whereas Mechanized Warfare cares about your red sources of damage as well as any artifacts you control that damage things or opponents. Another popular-ish commander, but also a card like Torbran that sees a lot of play just in the 99 of decks, is Obosh the Prey Piercer, which says, if a source you control with an odd mana value would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals double that damage to that permanent or player instead. So, Obosh doesn't care about the color or type of the source of the damage, it only cares about the mana value being odd. It's also worth noting that Obosh doesn't replace the damage with a constant amount of damage, but instead it just doubles whatever the damage would have been. Okay, I could keep listing other examples of replacement effects like Embermaw Hellion, Fiery Emancipation, Dictate of the Twin Gods, and Furnace of Wrath, and so on and so forth, but let's get to it. So, if I have out a Torbran, Obosh, and Mechanized Warfare on my battlefield, and then I cast Lightning Bolt targeting you, how much damage does the bolt do? Obviously, since I control all 4 of these things, and then that means I get to set the order for it, so that means that the bolt is going to do 3 damage, plus the 1 from Mechanized Warfare to 4, and then 4 plus 2 from Torbran to 6, and then 6 doubled from Obosh to 12, right? Sadly, for me and my bolt, that is not the case. When deciding the order of replacement effects, we do not use anything like timestamps, we do not use things like active player, non-active player order, and we do not let the controller of the replacement effects, as all those are the 3 most common things that I've heard in games. Those are the 3 most common ideas or assumptions that people have about how to handle them. The actual way in which they are handled is ordered by the player who is being affected by the damage or controls the object being affected by the damage. So in this case, you, being the one that is being damaged by the bolt, gets to pick the order and it's clearly smartest for you to have Obosh apply his doubling effect first, so it goes from 3 to 6 damage, and then adding the 1 and 2 damage to that 6, so a total of 9 damage from that lightning bolt. One interesting thing to note is that certain replacement effects can actually stop an event from ever happening, as well as stop other replacement effects from happening down the line. So let's get into some examples of this, and the first one is with another recent card from Warhammer 40k products, and that is Gearson Starn Kellermorph. Hope I'm saying that right. He has a triggered ability that says whenever another source you control deals exactly 1 damage to a permanent or player, Gearson Starn Kellermorph deals 2 damage to that permanent or player. I saw in a game someone running a Gearson Starn deck, and then he played a Mechanized Warfare, and was excited to have it increase the damage of all the tiny little pings that he was dealing, as well as increasing the damage from Starn's trigger of 2 extra damage. And I sadly had to break it to him that the Mechanized Warfare would actually replace the events of exactly 1 damage being dealt, stopping the Starn from ever seeing that event happening and causing his triggered ability to trigger. Specifically, it would only replace his cards like Cinder Pyromancer to not be seen by the Starn because they're red. But if he did get into some pinging with his Prodigal Sorcerer type of creatures, then the Mechanized Warfare would ignore those, and therefore Starn would see them dealing just 1 damage, and then Starn would trigger and deal 2 plus 1 damage from the Mechanized Warfare, adding 1 onto his 2 triggered ability damage. I hope all this math stuff isn't too confusing with how I'm saying it. I wrote it knowing this would be a little confusing, but now after reading it, it's like, oh my goodness, this is just a lot of numbers being spewed out. So I hope that this is all making sense. Now, let's take a look at something a little different than a replacement effect stopping a triggered ability event from happening. Let's take a look at a replacement effect stopping another replacement effect. Let's say that this time on my battlefield, I control a Torbran and a Mechanized Warfare, and I also control a Mana Barbs, which is one of the most deadly cards in any deck with these creatures that I've talked about in this episode. As the commander of those decks, they are, this Mana Barbs is powerful. So Mana Barbs is an enchantment that says whenever a player taps a land for mana, Mana Barbs deals 1 damage to that player. This means that currently, with the Torbran and Mechanized Warfare that I have out, every time you tap a land for mana, you would take 1 plus 1 plus 2 damage. So 4 damage total. Yes, you could change it to where it would be 1 plus 2 plus 1, but either case, that both would end up being 4 total damage. That's freaking brutal. To tap your lands for mana and to be taking 4 damage for each one. But if you control a card like Urza's Armor, then something might be a little different. Now, here's the card as it was printed in Urza's Saga, but its text here looks more like a triggered ability as it says that whenever word and doesn't say instead. So let's take a look at the more up-to-date version from 8th edition, not exactly super recent, but still more updated, and it says, if a source would deal damage to you, prevent 1 of that damage. So, keen-eyed players may notice that this card doesn't say instead. This is not a replacement effect, but is instead a prevention effect. But in the Comprehensive Rules, section 616, we can see that their interaction with replacement effects is handled the same way as replacement effects affecting other replacement effects. So how does that make this situation actually change? This doesn't mean that when you tap your land for mana that you will now take 1 plus 1 plus 2 damage to 4, and then the armor says, well, now do 4 minus 1 down to 3. No. I mean, you could handle it that way if you wanted, but again, you as the affected player gets to pick the order of all the effects, replacement and prevention. So, the Mana Barbs will try to deal 1 damage to you, and you can order the effects as so. Urza's Armor first, then Mechanized Warfare, and then Torbran. You could also swap it to be Urza's Armor, Torbran, than mechanized warfare. And if you did this, you would end up taking 0 damage. Yes, 0. Not 3, but absolutely no damage, even from tapping all of your lands, because each land tapped is a separate individual trigger from the mana barbs. The reason for this is that the 1 mana barb's damage will be reduced by the Urza's armor from 1 to 0. And this is where things get interesting. Let's take a look at the comprehensive rules and read comprehensive rules 120.8. That says, if a source would deal 0 damage, it does not deal damage at all. That means abilities that trigger on damage being dealt won't trigger. It also means that replacement effects that would increase the damage by that source or would have that source deal that damage to a different object or player have no event to replace, so they have no effect. So 0 damage means no damage at all, which means the mechanized warfare will see a damage value now of 0, and it will make no attempt at all to increase that 0 damage to +1, and then same with the Torbrand trying to increase it to +2. Bonus question, I control all of these cards: Mechanized Warfare, Obosh, Torbrand, Embermaw Hellion, Fiery Emancipation, Dictate of the Twin Gods, and Furnace of Wrath. And then I cast a lightning bolt targeting you for 3 damage. You control an Urza's armor as well as Divine Presence, which is an enchantment that says, if a source would deal 4 or more damage to a permanent or player, that source deals 3 damage to that permanent or player instead. Assuming that you want to take as little damage as possible, what is that lowest possible damage you could take in this crazy situation? Order these around how you think you could take as little damage as possible. Now, let's run that again, but this time I've cast an Arrow Storm targeting you after I've attacked this turn, and it says, Arrow Storm deals 4 damage to any target. Raid. If you've attacked this turn, instead, Arrow Storm deals 5 damage to that permanent or player, and the damage can't be prevented. Again, what is the least amount of damage that you would be able to come away with in this situation? Anyhow, that's all I've got for today's episode. As always, I hope that all of you have found this video to be entertaining at least, and I hope that a few of you have even learned something about the crazy rules in this great game of Magic. Have a good one. Ta-ta.